So, second video of the night, sorry about that, but square roots, another overview, things I want you to take a look at. I'm going to expect you to have the perfect squares memorized from 0 all the way up to 20, so 20 times 20, 400. I'm going to ask you the square root of 169. I expect you to be able to tell me that is 13. So we'll take a look at that, and we'll also take a look at what happens when I'm looking at a fraction. 4 over 9, how do I take the square root of that? And so you should be able to answer that question by the end of the video. And then the final thing is something that you may not have considered in the past, but square roots really have a positive and a negative result. So you really need to understand what I'm talking about when I say that the square root of 25 is not just 5, but is also negative 5. So let's get started. So let's first of all talk about how we say. So if I read something like this, I'm actually saying radical 25. Or I'm going to find the square root of 25. And all the square root means, as you hopefully remember, is what number times itself will give me this number inside the radical sign. So the funny sign that you see here, if you don't know what it's called a radical. And then the number inside is the thing that is actually called a radicand. I don't expect you to memorize that. But the number inside the radical is what we're looking to find, or the solution for it. So radical 25, or the square root of 25, is 5 times 5. Now something you may not have considered is, by definition, the square root is what number times itself will give me my answer inside the radical. So what times itself will give me 25? 5 times 5 gives me 25. Is there another number times itself that would also give me 25? Pause the video and think about it. How many of you came up with negative 5 times negative 5? Negative 5 times negative 5 does equal 25, and it's multiplying by itself. So the square root of 25 could be a positive 5 or a negative 5. Now, for now, until I tell you otherwise, we're just going to deal with the positive square root. So if I ask you to find the square root of 25, I expect you to give me the answer 5. Okay. All right. I also, like I said before in the brief intro, expect you to come up with the perfect square. So the square root of 0 is 0. The square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 9 is 3. And I want you to continue this table all the way to 20. So the square root of 400 is 20. So pause the video or do this afterwards, but I will be looking for this in your notes tomorrow. You don't have to sit down and memorize it just by memorizing, but the more you use it, the more it will become part of you. So when I say square root of 169, you'll be able to say 13. It'll make your life so much easier when we're dealing with radicals. Okay. Now, what happens if you run across something like this? What number times itself will give me negative 36? Well, my first thought is 6 times 6. Does that get me to negative 36? No. Okay, well, let's make it negative 6 times negative 6. Does that get me to negative 36? No, they're both positive 36 is my solution. Well, how about negative 6 times 6? Is that the square root of a number? By definition, the square root is multiplying itself. Is negative 6 and 6 the same thing? No. So is there a square root of negative 6? Very important concept. Is there a square root of any negative number at this point? And the answer is No. Now when you get to Algebra 2, they'll tell you how you can find a solution. But for now, we're just going to put no real solutions, because there is something called imaginary numbers, and they do have solutions to the square root of a negative number. But for today, in Algebra 1, your answer is no real solutions. What about this then? The square root, negative square root of 36. Well, we're just going to follow PEMDAS. PEMDAS says that we do what first? Parentheses, exponents. And we already talked about how we'll deal with this like an exponent. So the square root of 36 is 6. We still have our negative from the outside. So the negative square root of 36 is negative 6. Do we see the difference here? This is the square root of negative 36, and this is the negative square root of 36. We're taking the square root of 36 and then multiplying it by negative. And I think I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. It's really saying negative 1 times the square root of 36. So if I asked you what the negative square root of 25 is, you'd say square root of 25 is 5, and I have a negative on the outside, so it's negative 5. And the last example I want to show you tonight is what I do when I deal with fractions. And they're really not as scary as they first appear. You can do this two different ways, and I'm fine with it. It is okay with radicals to rewrite this as the square root of 25 divided by the square root of 81. Well, what's the square root of 25? What's the square root of 81? And you're finished. That's all we're looking for there. You could take the quick step and just write 5 over 9, and that's fine too. But all this is saying is take the square root of the numerator, the square root of the denominator. Please make sure they're really asking for you to find the square root of both. This is not the same as this. This says square root of 25 over 81. This says the square root of the fraction 25 over 81. Make sure we understand the difference. One last thing to think about. Here's a word problem. There's a quilt that is 13 square feet. And we know that the quilt is a square by definition. So some number times itself equals 13. And we're going to take a look at this later on, but we know that the quilt is 13 square feet. Well, if my quilt was 16 square feet, how long would each side be? Square root of 16 is 4. And so we would know it would be a 4 by 4. If my quilt was 9 square feet, square root of 9 is 3. So we know that our quilt is somewhere, the measurements are somewhere between the square root of 16 and the square root of 9. So the dimensions of this particular quilt are somewhere between 3 and 4. From there we can just do some guess and check, although I'm thinking this is 3 away from here and 4 away from here. It's going to be closer to 4 than it is to 3, so my first guess and check would be 3.6. And we can check that later on. But hopefully that makes sense. What I want you to be able to estimate. I'm going to wrap up the video now. I know you've had 2 fairly long videos, but hopefully they were pretty straightforward for you, so the note taking was pretty easy. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.